Welcome to Unit 3 of our course on the history and theology of the Eucharist. In our last unit, we started laying the foundations for theology of the Eucharist by looking at the Old Testament and prefigurements and foreshadowments of the Eucharist in the Old Testament using this typological reading. We're going to build on that beginning from the Old Testament, and you'll see as we look into the New Testament texts that the New Testament relies heavily on the Old Testament. There's a difference, but it's in continuity. The Eucharist is something radically new in a sense, but it's understood in the context of everything that came before it. And so to understand the Eucharist as a Christian reality, we have to understand it through the lens of its Jewishness and its rootedness in the Old Testament. So, as we look at New Testament texts, you'll see we're going to be referring constantly back to the Old Testament. Now, as we move through these lectures, a couple of things. One, we can't possibly cover everything in these lectures. The book already was something like 50 pages, and there have been entire books written on the Eucharist in the New Testament. So all we can do is highlight some key themes and key passages. So I'm highlighting some of the things from the book and bringing in a few other things as well. So you have a lifetime to go and read other things about this topic. And then secondly, just so you know, I might move a little slowly through this because I'm looking at both my, my slides on the screen as well as my notes as well as the scriptural text itself. I would highly recommend as we go through these that you have a Bible open and you're looking at texts, and if I'm referencing a text that I don't have on the screen, that you pause the video perhaps and go look up the passage and read the passage and its context. So let's begin, and the first thing I want to note, just a preliminary point, a first point on some context. The scriptures, as we have them, don't give us, say, a transcript, a newspaper report of the Last Supper. Jesus said X, and Peter said Y, and Judas did Z, and then, right? There's a record, but it's not that kind of record. The gospel writers, the scriptural writers, convey to us the truth of what Christ really did and said and taught, but they do so through a lens. So each of the scriptural writers selects certain information and arranges it and interprets it for their audience and for certain theological purposes. This is important because we're going to look at the words of Christ at the Last Supper. And they're not the same in the four accounts we have. There are variations. There are differences. And we have to ask why. And we'll see that Matthew was writing to a different audience than Luke. And Mark had different priorities or needs in mind than Paul. And so that's going to shape and color their presentation. Now, one of the things that shapes and colors the scriptural presentation is the church's liturgical practice. Now, think about this for a moment. Christ handed over at the Last Supper the command to do this in memory of me. And we see already in the Acts of the Apostles that the early church is carrying out the breaking of the bread. So to this first point on the screen, liturgical practice precedes and influences the composition of the biblical institution narratives. That is to say, before Matthew ever wrote Matthew, and before Paul ever wrote 1 Corinthians, Christians were already celebrating the Eucharist. So the liturgical practice preceded the biblical writing. And liturgical practice influences how the scriptural writers structure and convey their narratives. And we'll see some examples of this. By the time Matthew and Mark are writing, they most likely have a community in which there's a set liturgical structure to the Eucharist, and that influences how they present the story of the Last Supper. So the community's Eucharistic celebrations in the early church, as I just said, used already fixed formula that are then reflected in the New Testament documents. So all that is to say, our biblical evidence, when we look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, 1 Corinthians, our biblical evidence is both a reflection of the historical Last Supper and simultaneously a witness to the earliest Christian celebrations of the Eucharist. So it's evidence for both. It's evidence going back to the historical Last Supper, and it's evidence of how the communities of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Paul celebrated the Eucharist. It's the work of historians and biblical exegesis to uncover the layers of where the historical Last Supper, we have that primary information, and where it's influenced by later celebration. So an important question we can start with is one that Feingold brings up in his book. When did Jesus celebrate the Last Supper? This is tied to the idea of the Passover. And we're going to start here because we saw with the Old Testament and the prefigurements of the Eucharist that one of the primary figures or images of the Eucharist in the Old Testament is the Passover meal, the Passover lamb. This was what Thomas Aquinas said, that the Paschal lamb is the primary figure of the Eucharist in the Old Testament. So we'll start with the Passover here in the New Testament. It turns out all four Gospels agree that Jesus died on Good Friday, a few hours before sundown at the beginning of the Jewish Sabbath. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Jesus dies on Good Friday, on Friday, right, just before sundown. But there seems to be apparent discrepancies in the Gospels as to when Jesus celebrates the Last Supper. So this is the question of the relationship of the Last Supper to Passover and then also to the crucifixion. The Synoptic Gospels clearly consider the Last Supper to be a Passover meal. So for instance, just turning to Matthew 26, verse 17, Jesus says to them, it says, "Now on the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus, saying, 'Where will you have us prepare for you to eat the Passover?'" The texts I give you here in Mark and Luke are parallels. Jesus is celebrating in the Synoptics a Passover supper when he's celebrating the Last Supper, where he institutes the Eucharist. However, in John, Jesus is crucified on the day that ended at night with the celebration of the Passover supper. So I know that sentence is a little complicated. This is to say, in John, Jesus dies on the cross, and it's that night that the law-abiding Jews were to celebrate the Passover. So we see this, I gave you some passages here. Those who accused Jesus before Pilate, these law-abiding Jews, intended to eat the Paschal meal on the following day. So you can turn to these, if you like, John chapter 18 and verse 28 says, "They led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the praetorium. It was early. They themselves did not enter the praetorium, so that they might not be defiled, but might eat the Passover." Right? So for John, the Passover is still to come after the crucifixion. You see something similar in John 19:14, where it says, "Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover." It was about the 6th hour. This is where Jesus is before Pilate. So it's still in preparation, at least in this translation, preparation of the Passover. So the question becomes, how could Jesus have celebrated the Passover before his crucifixion, according to the Synoptics, when Passover did not begin until several hours after his death, as John would have it? So there are several suggested solutions to this, and our author brings these or discusses all of these. The first would be the synoptic hypothesis. This is perhaps, I think, the easiest. Um, I know our author suggests the Passover hypothesis that harmonizes the accounts. I personally think this is the simplest, um, most straightforward, just the easiest solution, and that is the Passover took place on Thursday as the synoptics say. So historically, the synoptic gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke have it right. The Last Supper was a Passover meal. John's timeline then would be more theological than chronological. So it would be structured. John would be structured to present Jesus as the true Paschal Lamb. So the synoptics have a closer connection then between Last Supper and Passover, as where John would have a closer connection between crucifixion and Jesus being the Paschal Lamb. Jesus then in John would have died at the same time the Paschal lambs were being slaughtered for the Passover, which would then follow. I think this is the simplest answer, that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, drawing on different sources, have the chronology right, the timing, the historical day, and John coming later, having a very theological gospel, arranges his chronology theologically. John does this in other places in his gospel. The cleansing of the temple in John is much earlier than it is in the synoptics. He structures his chronology for other reasons. I don't think this harms the historicity of John either, that John tells us the truth about Christ. It's a truth told through a theological lens. But there are other hypotheses. The exact opposite one would be the Johannine hypothesis. So some argue that the Last Supper was not a Passover meal. John's chronology is correct, and the synoptics are simply wrong. As Jesus is celebrating the Last Supper in John, it's before the Passover. Some will say, yes, maybe that's correct, but it's at least a Paschal type of meal. So there's another version of this would be an anticipatory hypothesis, that the Last Supper was indeed a Paschal meal, a Passover meal, but an anticipated one, ahead of time. So Joseph Youngman, a liturgical scholar, says, thus, even if the meal itself was not the Paschal meal proper, it was in a Paschal atmosphere and a spirit, Paschal atmosphere and spirit, and had a Paschal character. So even if you go with the Johannine hypothesis, that it's not on the day of Passover, it certainly had characteristics of a Passover meal, even for John. Do we have to choose one or the other? Chronology. Is one simply historically right and the other historically wrong? Well, there are two hypotheses that suggest we can harmonize the two. One that's gained popularity in recent time is the Essene calendar hypothesis. This is the one, as our author points out, is somewhat favored by Pope Benedict. The Essenes were one group of Jews during the time of Christ. You've heard more in the scriptures of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, but there were other sects of Jews. One being the Essenes, who lived in Qumran and who rejected temple sacrifice and celebrated by a different calendar. So this hypothesis suggests that John is correct in stating that Jesus died in the afternoon of the 14th of Nisan before the prescribed time by the law for the Passover meal. So that is to say that this suggests the chronology, the calendar, is correct in John. However, Jesus could have celebrated the Passover meal earlier, so this is a kind of anticipation, but it's not arbitrary, it's for a reason. Jesus could have celebrated the Passover meal earlier according to the Essene solar calendar. So we know that not all Jews followed the same liturgical calendar, even at the time of Christ. This is suggesting that Jesus was following one particular Jewish calendar, one particular sect, the Essenes. The Jewish leaders mentioned in John then followed the official temple calendar, which was a lunar calendar. And under this hypothesis, Jesus' Last Supper would have been on a Tuesday night. And it turns out there are some early church documents, liturgical documents, early church writings that even talk about the Last Supper being on a Tuesday night. The benefit here is a harmony that comes about. Under this hypothesis, the Synoptic Gospels are correct that Jesus celebrated the Last Supper as a Passover meal, because it was done according to a Jewish calendar in which it would have been the Passover. At the same time, John would be correct that the Jewish authorities did not celebrate the feast until the evening of Good Friday. So the official Passover was yet to come, or the Passover celebrated by temple authorities was yet to come. So this hypothesis, again, has the benefit of you don't have to choose one or the other of being right or wrong. And it also brings out the typology of both. For the Synoptics, the Last Supper is a Passover meal. And for John, the crucifixion happens at the same time as the slaughtering of the Passover lambs. Now, our author, Feingold, suggests another hypothesis that goes back to some of the church fathers and to Thomas Aquinas. He calls it the Passover hypothesis. And this is just to say the two accounts really harmonize perfectly once you understand the language. So this says that John's gospel follows actually the same chronology, the same calendar as the Synoptics. There is no contradiction. The Last Supper is on Thursday evening, and the idea that John puts Passover on Friday night is actually a misunderstanding of John's terminology. So it's been suggested for this, that the meal in John 13:2, which is the Last Supper, it's John 13:2 for John 13 and continues. The meal that Jesus had has features of a Passover meal. Although he doesn't say it, it has these paschal characteristics. Things like the participants reclining at table is typical of a Passover meal. The dipped morsel is an expression of a Passover practice. That it took place at night. There are other significant aspects to that point to it, suggest it is a Passover meal. John 18:28, where it talked about they would not enter the praetorium because they didn't want to be defiled so they could eat the Passover. This suggests that the passage could refer to the sacrifices eaten during Passover week. So that is to say, the language of eat the Passover could refer not just to the Passover meal or Passover lamb, but to sacrifices throughout the entire Passover week. John 19:14, where my translation in English says day of preparation for Passover, that's actually more of an interpretation. The language in the original is just day of preparation. And so this suggests that day of preparation could simply mean Friday, because it's the day of preparation for the Sabbath every week. And in fact, you can look at John 19:31 and 19:42, just later in that chapter, where day of preparation simply means the day of preparation for the Sabbath. So it would not be pointing forward to the Passover. So this would suggest a harmony between the two. And again, this suggests itself because it's favored by theologians, great theologians, such as John Chrysostom and Thomas Aquinas. This is the suggestion by our author. Again, I think the synoptic hypothesis is most likely, but there are, scholars debate these things. What we want to ask the question, though, why is this important? And let's see. Oh, I'll get there in a second. So let's look. We'll ask, why is it important? But for now, let's understand the Passover meal a little bit more clearly, because it will shed light on what's going to come up in the institution narratives in a bit. So let's stay on the topic of the Eucharist and the Passover, and look at the Jewish Passover meal. It's also called a Seder meal. And we know what kind of structure it had before the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. So there was a very specific ceremonial. So this Passover meal, this Seder meal, there would be a blessing of the day and a blessing of a first cup by the father of the house. Now the thing to note here as we go through, there are 4 cups. That will become important later. In a Passover Seder meal around the time of Christ, there are 4 cups. So there's the blessing of the first cup, then a preliminary course of bitter herbs and unleavened bread. Then there's the Paschal ritual itself. There's a child asks a question about why is this night different than any other night, and then the father responds about being taken out of Egypt. There's the first part of the Hallel psalm sung, these songs of praise, and then blessing of a participation in a second cup. Then the meal proper begins with the blessing pronounced over the bread, which was then broken and passed around the table, the eating of the Paschal lamb, the third cup, which is known as the cup of blessing, and then the table prayer by the father of the house. And then the second part of the Hallel Psalms and the prayer of thanksgiving over a fourth cup. Oops, before I go on. So just notice this structure: 2 cups, then the meal with the blessing of bread, which is shared, a third cup known as the cup of blessing, and then a fourth cup, along with some singing of hymns, the Psalms. You'll see this pattern come out particularly in the Gospel of Luke. Paul also talks about in 1 Corinthians 10, the cup of blessing which we bless, which may be a reference to this third cup. So this is just to note this now. We'll talk more about it later. Here's what Joseph Youngman says about this structure of the cups. Now, in all probability, Jesus made use of the preliminary act of the Paschal meal proper, that is the blessing over the bread. Here I have it in red here, right before the third cup. Jesus probably used that, the blessing of the bread, to bring home to his disciples the mystery of the new bread. And in the same way, after the supper, he pronounced the words of consecration over the third cup of wine. Again, we'll see this more in Luke. Okay, I had asked before, why is this important, the Passover for the Last Supper? Why is the Passover a fitting time for the Last Supper? One reason is because it demonstrates the continuity and yet the passage between the great sacraments of the Old and the New Covenants, right? The Eucharist is something radically new, yes, but it grows out of what came before as the fulfillment grows out of the figure, right? So this chart kind of shows the idea of the relationship. On the top, you have the Old Testament. On the bottom, you have the New. Notice in the middle, you have the fundamental events in both the Old and the New Covenant. In the Old Covenant, in the middle, the fundamental event is the Exodus event. The people are led out of slavery. And the fundamental event in Christianity is the sacrifice of Calvary. And we would add the entire Paschal mystery, the death and resurrection of Christ, the suffering, death, resurrection, and ascension of Christ. That's our central event. Now look in the Old Testament. There was an anticipation of the Exodus, and that's the Passover sacrifice meal, with the sacrifice of the lamb and the spreading its blood on the door and the partaking of the lamb. That is it happened before and anticipated the Exodus. In the New Testament, we have a similar, a parallel. We have the Last Supper, which took place, according to our synoptic accounts, right, as a Last Supper meal. Right? It's a sacrifice meal that anticipates the sacrifice of Calvary. And then what happens in the Old Testament? That Passover is Israel's yearly celebration of the Passover. Right? It's a yearly celebration, and through it, the people share in the saving events of the Exodus. Right? For the people of the Old Testament, to celebrate the Passover every year was to participate in leaving Egypt. They were participating in the works of God, in the saving works of God. Each individual must consider him or herself as personally having gone out of Egypt. The memorial that the Passover meal and sacrifice is not something just to remember the past, but to make the past present here and now and to participate in it. And again, in a similar way, as the Last Supper was an anticipation of Christ's sacrifice on Calvary, the Christian repeated celebration of the Eucharist is our celebration, our memorial of Christ's Passover, of the sacrifice of Calvary, in which we not only remember, but also take part. As Paul will say, we'll see in 1 Corinthians 10, is not the cup of blessing that we bless a koinonia, a participation in the blood of Christ. That'll end this first video. In the next video, we will start to look at the institution narratives in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and 1 Corinthians.